do not try to write your magnum opus, your best book ever, as your first book. Take a narrower focus, write about something you know well that your potential clients care about, and focus on that first.
Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. So today on the show, I'm very excited to welcome back Karl Sakas. Karl, for those that don't know you, can you give everybody the quick H1?
Absolutely. Dan, great to be back. Looking forward to helping people. So Karl Sakas here. I'm an agency advisor, coach, consultant, and trainer. I help agency owners who are at major transition points. For instance, they're looking to sell their agency in the future, but their numbers aren't quite there yet. Or maybe they're looking to run a lifestyle agency, but they're not optional enough, and they're stuck doing things they don't like doing. Ultimately, I help agency owners work less and earn more, while also rewarding their best team members.
That's great. And those are all very important things. And I think you have a great way of sort of tying yourself to the why and the meaning behind these sorts of things. So
Yeah.
otherwise it seems like why are we doing any of these tactics? So that's really important. I think we talk at least every 6 months, 12 months, I want to say. And the new update, I think since March, is you have a book out. And I've published a couple books before. The last one was more of a concerted effort. Why did you want to write a book?
So Calm the Chaos, the new book, is my fourth book. And my previous one, called Work Less, Earn More, How to Escape the Daily Grind of Agency Ownership, was all about that, working less and earning more. But one of the key ways to do that is through leading your team. And so I wanted to dig deeper on that, and that's how Calm the Chaos came about. It's 10 ways to run a better agency. It's really a leadership and people management book. I mentioned diving deeper. It's still short. It's just over 100 pages, or if you get the audio version, which I narrated, it's just under 2.5 hours. So, it's what to know to get better results through your team so that you can step back to do what you'd rather be doing.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into the 10 ways. I think sometimes I talk about, writing a book, and occasionally agency owners would be like, oh, how did you ever do that? And then I'm like, it's probably not as hard as you think. And everyone has a different process. And I think it's very idiosyncratic in my experience in terms of like how the book spills out of people. Can you talk just real quick? Can you talk about your process a little bit? How did this book come out of you?
Yeah. Well, I knew I wanted the follow-up to Work Less and More, and originally I was thinking of expanding on the leadership points from the book, and then I realized that if I expanded those, it would turn into a 400-page book. So I was like, all right, let's reboot. Let's focus on a different strategy. If we were sharing almost from scratch, what would the leadership and people management advice look like? I think I would probably enlist AI for more help on that, and, will around outlining the next book. But that was a manual process, and I identified 10 ways, and I've organized them by, kind of beginning with the end in mind, in the book. And then once I had the outline, I was filling in each of the sections, getting feedback from team members as editors around what's the right order of things, what needs additional detail, what needs less detail, and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And I found that the last book I had kind of just spilled out of me, and I spent way more time editing than writing it.
Yeah.
What was your experience? Was it a slog writing it, or did it just kind of like, I found that for me personally, I had so many pent up ideas and so many things I was like irritated about, but
Right.
wanted to get your thoughts.
On one hand, writing each book has gotten easier in the sense that I know what to expect. It's also gotten harder because now, I keep raising the bar and setting higher standards for what I want to do now that I know it's possible. Which, by the way, when I'm advising agency owners about writing books, one of my suggestions is do not try to write your magnum opus, your best book ever, as your first book. Take a narrower focus, write about something you know well that your potential clients care about, and focus on that first, because once you write your first book, you'll have a lot of lessons learned for the next one. For instance, my first book in 2015 is on speaking for agency lead gen. It's called The In-Demand Marketing Agency, How to Become an Agency of Choice Through Speaking. And I'm actually going to be doing a second edition of that based on, sort of the 10, 11-year anniversary of what I've learned. So don't put pressure on yourself to write the magnum opus as your first book.
Yeah.
It helped that I wrote the speaking book, then a pocket guide on leadership, and then Work Lesser and More as kind of the mega book as book number 3.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think another thing that stops people is this idea that your thinking can never change or you can never advance on the thoughts you had in the book.
Yeah.
And really, and the other thing that stops people is this idea of oh, couldn't this just be a blog post? And the whole point of the book, for me anyway, is that it's a costly signal. It's an exclamation point. You're saying these are the ideas that I've been batching up for a long time,
Yeah.
as opposed to just a blog article that you can chill out overnight or something.
And certainly you could do what I would call the blog sandwich book, where there's an intro, blog posts, and some sort of a closing piece of bread at the end, or maybe multiple sandwiches and all. That's an option. It's probably not going to get the best reviews, but if the goal is to get a book out, that's an option. Um, you know, uh, one other shortcut for writing a book would be do a course first. So, for instance, I came up with the Work Less, Earn More 4 stages of day-to-day involvement back in 2019. The idea of making yourself increasingly optional, the different stages along the way. What I was missing, though, was the how to get from stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And what I realized was, let's do a workshop. I created the Work Less, Earn More Agency Growth Bootcamp because I had to sort out the how to share it in the boot camp. And actually, some of the questions that I got from people helped make the book even better as I was developing that. For instance, there were a lot of questions, to my surprise, about hiring a virtual assistant. I've had a VA for over a decade in different forms, providing administrative support. So to me, that was just sort of normal. But people had a lot of questions, and so I was able to address that and build that into the book. So if you're stuck, get help from generative AI around brainstorming angles, topics, and things like that. But then create a training, and that'll force you to organize things.
Yeah, and without doing a really long sidebar on AI, because I want to get into the meat of the book.
Yeah.
I like what you're saying, because I think a lot of the times when you hear people talking about using AI, it's simply to do things that they would normally have to put labor into, versus using AI to think and to expand your knowledge, like the meme of the guy walking into the cosmos or whatever with all the colors. That's the next thing, is
Yeah.
using it to expand the way you normally think, which I think is important. Yep.
Exactly. So, and again, don't try to make your first book the perfect book. You likely, I think most people have several books in them. Though, by the way, for anyone who's listening and you're like, I hate writing, don't write a book. But you don't have to write a book. But if there's something that you're just hankering to share, and ideally that also helps your business, go for it. I'm also in the midst of planning a book related to collecting art. Kind of my take on that from what I've learned, kind of early to mid stage on that. So I'm definitely going to use what I've learned on the agency growth books for that as well, though a different focus, different audience.
Yeah, now I have to ask, so we're going to go on another side quest. What are there any parallels between collecting art and running a successful agency?
Oh. I was at a panel at an art show in New York, the Winter Show. It was attending a panel, and I asked one of the questions was this. I was on the market for drawings. I learned that the low end of the drawing market is under $50,000, and I'm like, I have not spent that much on a drawing, so I'm definitely at the low end of the drawing market. But one of the questions I asked was, I was a panel of gallerists, curators, and others, was, around how to develop my sense of taste and discernment. I think I was seeing them as the same thing, taste and discernment. And one of the panelists clarified that those are actually two related, but two different things. Taste is what you like. You could look at a painting or some other piece of art, or client work or potentially a client if you want to work. And from a taste perspective, it's like, is this something I like art wise or a client that I want to work with? Discernment, though, is about your judgment about, is this a good example? So you could have discernment about something that's not your taste or discernment about something that is your taste. For agency owners who are serving as the creative director or the chief strategist at their agency, you probably have pretty good discernment. Now, sometimes they can get you in trouble where maybe your discernment is higher than the client's discernment, and they may not be paying for that level of discernment and quality. But, that's a piece there. Pricing, agency pricing ideally is tied to the value of the impact of the work. Pricing for art, you're not exactly paying for the impact in the sense. I mean, there are some, bigger paintings tend to be more expensive than smaller paintings and things like that. Unique originals tend to be more expensive than a print or other edition, that kind of thing. But, to an extent, some of the pricing is in the eye of the beholder. The other thing, as I read other books on collecting, there's sort of this push-pull of people, want to ideally sell whatever it is eventually for more than they paid, but unless you're buying, Rothko, Picasso, Pollock, that kind of thing, you're probably not going to make, 1,000% profit. In fact, your heirs may be lucky to find someone who will take it as a donation because then they're going to have to deal with storing it and conserving it and so on. So, there are some parallels, some not, but fun either way.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I really like that frame. I've never heard that before, that the dichotomy between taste and discernment. And as you're talking and kind of making the parallel to the agency world, it reminded me of like in a previous life selling high quality animated video services. And as this was earlier days of the internet, there was less that was measurable, but there's still more that was measurable. So bigger companies and sort of more creative directory type CMOs just instantly got that they needed a quote unquote high quality video. But then we would get sort of more technical people, tech startup types, other kind of more performance marketers, and they'd be like, what's the ROI of this higher quality in the video? And there's no way to make it. Like, you'd have to have like some kind of randomized control trial, like thousands of however many people to figure it out. There's no way. Right. But it's interesting to compare it to the art market because it's the same thing, but art is just such a condensed way to peg it to a value, because it's like this Rothko is going for X in the global market or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other piece too is that there are also, issues around counterfeits, forgeries, and so on. If something is too good to be true, it probably is. But that ties into agency pricing. If you're charging $1,000 for something that your competitors are charging $5,000 or $20,000, even if you have the price structure to support the lower price, people may be suspicious about, why is it so cheap?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think that a lot of the times design creative agencies struggle with this. I think there's a lot of parallels to the art industry. I think if you could start thinking about it as like, your job is to find the people that appreciate high quality art, and have taste and discernment for what you do, as opposed to trying to convince somebody that this is worth whatever. Like, you're already so back-footed at that point. So
yeah. So this could be its own episode.
I'll keep things moving. So instead of going sequentially through those 10 things that calm the chaos, was there one of them that jumped out to you that was like, this is the kickoff for the book, that you find was not the most important, but the one that was like most intuitive, let's say?
Yeah, I'd say that would be what's tip number 2 in the book, which is accept that you are no longer the sole doer or answer person at your agency. When you start your agency, you're doing everything. I've identified 6 agency roles, which I talk about in Work Lesser and More, about AM, PM, SME, so like design, development, writing, things like that. Client strategy, biz dev, which I define as 3 things: marketing, sales, and partnerships. And then finally support, which is operations and leadership. In the early days, you're doing all of it. Maybe you start outsourcing some of the SME work. Maybe you're no longer the sole designer or developer or writer or analyst or what have you. Eventually, you may delegate project management. And then at some point, you're deciding, do you keep doing client strategy or do you get help? And do you keep doing sales and marketing or do you get help and things like that? But early days, you are doing everything. And as you delegate more, you may not be doing everything, but you are the answer person, right? Your team comes to you for, is this good enough? Or this happened, what should I do? Whether that's about client work or the actual work with the clients in terms of the account management. And at some point though, that breaks. I spoke at the SODA Academy, the Society of Digital Agencies, about a decade ago in New York, and one of the topics that came up where I was sharing advice from Made to Lead, the leadership book, one of the audience members said something really interesting. They said, you're probably not going to grow your agency beyond about 10 people if you have to be the answer person. Their point was, if you want everyone to come to you before they make a decision, before they tell a client something, what have you, if you want to be the answer person, okay, but you are not going to grow beyond 10 people.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess for agencies that are kind of stuck in that, let's say 8, 9 people, whatever, however you want to measure it, they're stuck in that area. What's the usual first role to think about? Or if that's too specific, what's the usual bottleneck that's stopping them from getting over that, if that makes sense?
A lot of it is that if an agency, say, has 8 or 9 people, you're still working with some of your original clients. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. And those clients are used to working with you as the owner. And they're expecting to work with you, which means you're probably effectively serving as their account manager, even if you have other team members helping on the subject matter expert kind of work, the sort of the fulfillment kind of things. Now, the delegation opportunity is for you to bring in another team member to serve as the account manager. Maybe you continue to be the strategist, the chief strategist on the account, but you're not their day-to-day contact.
Yeah.
And you can navigate that. You can say to the client, hey, my role is shifting. I will continue to be the strategist on your account, but I brought in so-and-so who's an expert on taking care of client relationships. They'll be your day-to-day contact, and then you'll see me, on whatever cadence in between. Now, that's a good direction to go in. And I've written an article about delegating client work, but you have to trust the client-facing person. And you could think of it as a Venn diagram. If for people listening, if you're struggling to let go of client work, or you have but you don't fully trust your team, Venn diagram, you need 3 things: desire, competence, and capacity. Your account manager needs the desire to be an account manager. They're not, say, deputized to do that on top of their other work. They need the competence to be an account manager, and competence is going to vary. If you're working with small businesses, that's a different level of AM competence than if you're working with enterprise clients, or if you're doing very technical work versus less technical work. But the AM needs competence. We've got desire, competence, and capacity is just having time in their schedule. One of the worst situations for capacity is around when an agency, say, head of client services, gets promoted to become the CEO of the agency. Maybe the owner's stepping back. They're like, hey, we're going to promote you. That's a great path. I've helped a lot of clients through that in terms of succession planning. The case where you get in trouble, and often this is where I'm called in, where people hadn't worked with me before on succession planning, is where that head of client services is now the CEO and still the VP of accounts or the director of client services or, EVP for delivery. You got to get out of that and get them out of it.
Yeah, that all makes sense, and I agree with all of it. I think one thing that I hear from agency owners a lot, because I always dig into, what do you enjoy doing? What is the thing for you that feels like play, for everybody else feels like work? That's the thing you'll outcompete everybody on. Not all the time, but a good percentage of the time, what I hear is, I like working with clients. I like coming up with strategy. I like doing the stuff that got me to the dance, basically.
Yes.
So for those owners, how did they get over that dilemma? Can they still embed themselves in the legacy role and have other people do everything else? Or is that not an option if they want to grow?
So I guess it depends on your growth goals. For instance, started working with a client recently where their current valuation is about $2 million, and their goal is to grow to a valuation of $8 million. They are not going to get to $8 million if they are still doing everything as they are now. They could still be doing potentially some of the higher end strategy work, but they're not going to be the day-to-day client. On the other hand, I have a client that I've worked with where, their goal is just to keep growing. They don't have a specific target, and they've done well at that. And one of their clients asked for the owner to continue being the contact, and that particular client is paying them over $1 million a year. Like the retainer is $100,000 a month, and it's going up. In that case, they decided, you know what, it's worth it for now. But say the agency grows to $30 million in revenue, $1 million a year isn't worth it for the owner to stay. On the other hand, if out of that 30 million and the client is, 4 million, okay, maybe that's worth it. The key here is that you have the opportunity to negotiate this with your clients. You could say, hey, I enjoy working with you. So-and-so will now be the account manager. I'll be the strategist, right? So you're not going away completely. At some point, you may need to leave them entirely as a strategist, and maybe you could set that up as an option. Talk about reason, options, choose. Give them a reason, give them 2 or 3 options. You've hand selected and let them choose. In that case, you might say, if you want me to stay on your account, your budget would now be some higher point. Or we're glad to continue with your current budget, or maybe something a bit more, with so-and-so as the lead on your account. And maybe the framing is, if you ever have any problems, I'm available if you have concerns, right? So it's not like you're totally abandoning them. But the point is, you're not the standard person. And if this is a client you want to keep, you might be less harsh about it. It kind of depends on that. But it's all negotiable. It's not just getting forced to do what the client wants you to do.
Right. That makes sense. I think tied to all this, before we go into the next way or method,
Yeah.
are there, what would you say are the biggest causes of the chaos? If you had to pick out a few, like what's driving this for most agencies?
There's the quote about every happy family is the same and every unhappy family is different.
That's the answer.
Yeah. So, that could be true to an extent at agencies. I mean, every agency is unique. I've worked with, at this point, over 600 agencies in 36 countries. Every agency is unique, but there are some patterns. So some of the patterns that I see, it could be that the owner has not fully delegated client work, or maybe the team thinks they have, but the owner kind of steps in and creates problems. That can be an issue. It could be working with clients that themselves have chaotic internal situations, and so their culture is spilling over and impacting your agency. For instance, I had a client as an agency PM and account manager where if I didn't answer the phone, like say I was in a meeting, he would start calling every extension in the office because he wanted to talk to someone. But you know what? Like his boss, the CEO and the founder of this billion-dollar company, was kind of a jerk, to put it lightly. And so as the head of marketing, he was under all of this pressure, which meant then the pressure transmitted to us. Now, they paid very well, like they had a great budget, and they trusted us with a lot, including getting help on hiring other agencies for things that weren't a match for our expertise, but they would pay us to figure out who are the other people to hire. So it wasn't necessarily the best relationship, but the ROI made it worth it. On the other hand, if you've got a client who's in panic mode every week, and they're paying you a very small amount, that is not worth it, right? Don't let their chaos turn into your chaos. It's hard to calm the chaos, but the chaos just keeps coming at you.
Yeah.
Good.
Sorry, Mikasha, I was just going to ask, like, or talk a little bit. Like, I think that a lot of the times what we hear is like, hey, do a better job picking clients, pick the clients that are right for you and your culture, and so on and so forth, which is all nice. It's kind of like saying, go to the gym, eat healthy, never, eat badly,
If that
go to bed early, do all the, we don't do it.
Yeah,
Because
during
the
it,
problem, Yeah, because the problem is like discipline. It's like the guardrail that keeps your car from going off the cliff. Like it's nice that it's there, but you don't want to rely on it to avoid. You want to just keep your car on the road,
Right.
which is a system, right? A road's basically a system.
Yes.
My metaphors are going everywhere. I apologize, but anyway, how, how does that resonate with you? And are there any systems that you're seeing for actually like making sure you don't pick that bad client that's going to be blowing up your phone and doing all these things?
I mean, the stronger your pipeline, the more picky you can be. If it's sort of the feast or famine situation, I mean, ideally it's less about feast or famine and more about well fed on a regular basis. And there's extra food available if you want it, but if not, the extra food can go on a client wait list. All right, extending the metaphor. So, the stronger your pipeline, the more picky you can be. And if you've got 3 clients and can only take one, you can make better decisions about which client, both in terms of budget as well as kind of your sense of what they'll be like as a client, than if you have one.
Yeah, exactly. Um, to kind of segue into pipeline, I think that what I tend to see is that when the pipeline is down,
Mm-hmm.
the agency is very likely to look towards macro signals, right? So they're likely to look towards the market, geopolitics, interest rates,
Mm-hmm.
something going on in their industry,
Yeah.
and be like, what's going on here? And that thing that frustrates me the most is like, it doesn't matter because it's not going to change the actions you should take, right? Unless you're going to shut down the agency
Yep.
or choose a different vertical, which is fraught with peril,
Yeah.
then you're going to have to do the same things. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, like because you also can't completely throw out the macro signals because maybe there are actions
No.
you could take. How do you recommend agencies sort of parse that and interpret the macro correctly?
Some clients refer to me as their agency therapist. I clarify I am not an actual therapist. We all benefit from therapy. But a therapist would point out focus on the things you can control, not the things you can't control. There's plenty in life that you can't control, and instead it's how do you deal with it? How do you react to it? How do you prepare for it? I've written an article about avoiding the agency doldrums. Back in the days of sailing ships, there would be the doldrums, which were particular points in the globe where often there was not wind for long periods of time, and you would get stuck in the doldrums. Now, you could plan ahead. You could, for instance, bring extra fresh water, extra food, extra other supplies. You could plan to be kind of like rowing the ship, which didn't go very well, but at least it would get you moving a little bit, and things like that. So you could plan ahead, but if you were stuck in the doldrums, you were stuck. Alternatives, of course, would be trying to plan the journey around the doldrums if you could, or not going there in the first place. But depending on what your business goals were, that may be unavoidable. So, when it comes to agency doldrums, that's things like not having cash reserves or not enough cash reserves, waiting too long to consider layoffs if that comes to that, potentially changing your industry focus if things aren't working. For instance, a lot of nonprofits are struggling based on various cuts. You have to decide, are you going to stick with it or keep going? If you stick with it and you've seen a big drop in revenue, you may need to do some layoffs or at least furloughs. So taking action is important, rather than just assuming that things magically will get better or otherwise. You're starting to say something good.
No, I was agreeing with all that. I think that another part of that, from my experience, is also taking on the identity as a risk manager, more like any other startup or portfolio manager or anything like that, where
Yeah.
a lot of like to give a tangible example, I think where this plays out is like on the topic of specialization or niching, right? So
Yeah.
it's like I don't want to specialize because then if that industry has a downturn, then I'm going to get hit. And the reality is like that's absolutely true. But if you don't specialize, then you're also taking on risk because it's going to be harder to sell and close business and
Yeah.
all these other things.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be niching. There's a lot of different ways to specialize, but that's one way that we see that play out. To kind of go further into pipeline, is there a part of the book that really focuses on dealing with that problem? Because that's the thing that we see most, and I love to hear kind of like how you're going about calming pipeline chaos.
Yeah. So tip number 6 out of the 10 is delegate intentionally, not recklessly. So the idea is that you want to delegate rather than abdicate. Abdicate would be saying to your team, we need more clients in the door, go figure it out. And you just like leave and expect them to go from there, and it's up to them. If you have a head of growth, head of revenue, head of marketing, head of sales, or maybe your head of accounts is also doing some of that, it is reasonable to expect them to be doing some of that work, but they need some direction from you. They need to understand, what is your mission, vision, and values for the agency. I've created a template that I use with clients because I'll ask when people start the initial engagement with me, the agency growth diagnostic. It's an 8 to 10 week structured process. They get advice on quick wins, longer term strategy, and so on. One of the questions I'll ask in the intake process and discovery is, what is your agency mission? What is your vision? And what are your values? I elaborate a little bit on what I mean by those. And then I also ask, if I were to ask one of your team members, what are those, the mission, vision, and values, what would they say? And often people will have a sense of values, not always a vision, not always a mission, or, it's kind of fuzzy. And inevitably, though, the question of what would your team say, uh, usually not very enthusiastic or confident answers for that. If people don't know where they're going, it's hard for them to help support you there. So if you're delegating, make sure the team knows what you're trying to accomplish. Otherwise, you're creating a leadership vacuum, and they're going to do the best they can with what they got, but that's not going to be enough to help them move toward your goals and what you want.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How valid is an answer of something to the effect of like, we don't know yet, like we're figuring it out and we need more reps in this industry or with this sort of service to figure out what those things are?
Yeah, I mean that's okay if it's like very early stage, but you know, for instance, a client, I did a culture survey for the agency, agency wide all hands survey, and one of the questions was like, where are we going? This was pre-COVID. They were asking, are we going to be in this office, for the future? Are we trying to like really grow our revenue? Is the goal to get acquired? Is the goal to acquire another agency? Like they wanted to know the context of what they were doing and how did it fit into kind of business in general beyond their individual role. And in a sense, I mean, those were good questions. Those were employees thinking like owners rather than just they do paid search all day. That's all they should do, or SEO or content or social media or design or what have you. Um, People need answers or else they're going to fill things in. Uh, if for instance, as an owner, you're in the midst of dealing with some sort of a personal crisis, whether it's health, relationship, otherwise, I would encourage you to tell your team. You don't need to tell them everything, but let them know that something is happening and hopefully, that you have a plan or you have some next steps. Otherwise, people are going to assume the worst.
Yeah.
For instance, if you've separated or are getting divorced and you're not telling the team about it, they know that something's up. I mean, they may think that you have cancer, or something like that. And they're wondering like what's going to happen. I mean, there is uncertainty for sure, including about ownership of the agency and things like that. But if you don't tell people, they tend to assume the worst. And even worse than that, they notice that you're not trusting them.
Right. And people will tend to catastrophize more than the other way around. So I think
Yeah,
that's a good point.
exactly.
I think back to the point you made about, delegating versus abdicating.
Yeah.
What we tend to see in a common listener is going to be the agency owner that has built the business on referrals, they get to a place where that's not enough anymore,
Right.
and they don't have enough hours in the day to prospect, and they have this onslaught of different tactics and plays that they can run to go out and find clients.
Yes.
So there could be a situation where there's somebody that could come and take it over and completely build the demand gen, lead gen system and everything. And we help with that. It's
Right.
a schema. But if you're hiring somebody to do that, it may not be a role that A, you have enough clarity to hire for, or B,
Right.
you could afford if you could.
Yeah.
So how do you think owners should solve that problem? Kind of a big question.
So, I mean, I think one of the big questions is, do you and your current team have the skill set to build the system? Because one of the things I'll say is the person who is skilled enough to build the system is usually too expensive to run the system, or at least run it long term. But at the same time, the person who is currently running the system usually doesn't have the skill to build it. I mean, eventually they will, but that's why people bring in outside experts to run things or to build things, at least, so that then people can run it internally. So, that's something to consider. Now you also have to decide, if you're adding something that's not critical to your agency's trajectory, you may not need to build something for it. Say you're thinking of adding a new service. For instance, I have a client that does a number of things, and they're thinking of bringing paid search in-house and also paid social. And they've done that through contractors before. And one of the things that I'm talking with the agency CEO and the founder are, when does it make sense to bring it in-house? And I've given them some homework about running the numbers and things like that. um, One of the initial questions is, will this be a core part of your future offering? The answer is for them is yes. So it does make sense to sort that out. On the other hand, I mean, say it's something about, say, content creation, and it's important and your clients need it, but, with AI related shifts, maybe you don't want to make that a core focus. Or maybe it's a service you sell, but you want to outsource it completely, like to white label agencies rather than doing it on a full stack basis. Your front end, you're doing the client facing work, and then you outsource it to the back end agency. So is it important to your future? If so, you probably should figure it out, potentially with the help of outside experts, and then plan to run it internally. So it's a complicated situation. There's not just one right answer, but what's your reaction to that?
Well, totally in agreement, because that's the specific pivot we made as a business, was to be builders and trainers versus doers, because
Right.
the doing, we just felt like it was too important to creating like the oxygen in the business to outsource,
Yeah.
and we felt like it was not ultimately helping our clients as much as we could. So
Yeah.
totally agree. I think tied to that is everything that's going on in M&A right now, and all these things are contributing to this wild thing called equity value. And over back to the ARC comparison, what's the market valuing all these things we're doing at, for better or worse?
Right.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Like what is the nature of this M&A activity, and how do all these other topics kind of filter into that?
I mean, certainly the stronger your agency is financially, the better a deal you'll get when you sell. That includes both the valuation as well as the terms. For instance, are you getting half down with a 3-year earnout, or are you getting 100% down and no earnout? Maybe with some employment, expectations and things like that. So, the stronger your numbers, the better a deal you'll get. That also includes things like being a specialist in a particular industry. For instance, I have a client that had turned down an offer for $20 million because they knew they could get to 40. They just got an offer for 28. They negotiated that up to 34. They're still working through some of the details. They are a specialist. The acquiring entity is focused on agencies in their particular specialty. If they were a generalist agency, even if they had the same financials, they would not have gotten the now $34 million offer. So, specialization is important, as are strong financials, as are the owner or owners being as optional as possible. Optional is relative, but for instance, I have a client I've worked with a number of years, and the two founders One basically works on demand, like maybe, a couple days a month. The other, who's more involved, is working 3 days a week, but that's 3 days a week, not five. And I've helped them build a succession plan to elevate a key team member to run things day to day. So, as they're now on the market, their situation is a lot stronger than the owner working 60 hours a week.
Yeah, that makes sense. And is there any in this M&A process, is there anything that you find that either for you or your clients that's underappreciated, like building blocks that need to be in place or opportunities that are out there?
You certainly need to find the right acquirer for you. If you want someone who's going to take good care of your team, you probably don't want to sell to a private equity firm. On the other hand, if you feel confident that your team is going to be fine and they can find new jobs and so on, you'll probably get paid more money if you sell to a private equity firm. They don't have the $5 million SBA 7A loan cap that an individual buyer might have. You also, maybe you like the work. Maybe your agency isn't quite as saleable right now. You could sell through an acqui-hire where you get a certain amount of money and then you take on a role in a new agency. That's an option. You also could sell to an internal buyer. But, in that case, you may not necessarily get top dollar. Maybe they're getting an SBA loan and maybe you're doing some seller financing to support them on the deal, things like that. The key is to sort out what kind of exit do you want. I've created a template on this, the exit plan template. That's part of my workshop, available on demand, control and maximize your agency exit. And part of it is identifying what is your ideal outcome. What do the numbers look like? What does it feel like once you've sold? What are you doing next? So I'd say get clear on what your ideal outcome is and then work backwards from there. So I don't know if that's that's not necessarily a specific secret or what have you, but it'll give you better results.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And is there anything that's changing with the nature of the activity right now and how these acquisitions are happening? Like, for example, what I hear a lot about is agency owners kind of aging out, if they're boomer Gen X age, and then so there's a lot of like selling activity happening. I'd love to hear what you're seeing.
Yeah. Some people definitely are like, I need to be out by the time I'm 60 or 65. Others are like, I need to be out by 50. And I worked with a client who had recently, who they were in their early 70s, and they were renewed in running the business. So it's all going to be unique to you. I will say I do see a lot of milestones related to major birthdays, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, or related to, say, kids heading off to college
Hmm.
or maybe graduating from college. One of the challenges is that as an agency owner, you are likely to get no need-based financial aid when your kids go to college. I did a 4-part series on that. Basically, like from a FAFSA perspective, if you're in the U.S., due to how your pass-through income is treated, the profits from your agency, colleges are counting that as income, because the IRS does, and you're probably not going to get any money. And you're going to be paying $150,000, maybe $300,000, all in. So, in that case, you might want to get through the tuition bills first and then retire. But that's, an example of something I'll say.
Yeah, definitely an argument for increasing take-home pay and socking it away.
Yeah.
So makes
And as a financial planner mentioned, where I interviewed him in the series, you can do things like super funding a 529 plan, where you can make multiple years of contributions at once, and then you can't, for several more years. So if you think the market's going to go up, you get a lot of money in now and take the growth.
yeah, I could definitely. I'm thankfully doing a 529 finally, so
Yes.
that's great. Great to hear. So, Carl, kind of getting towards the end of our time, is there anything you want to leave agency owners with? Anything that they should be paying attention to in the next few months, few years, let's say?
Yeah. Think about, do you want to be running your agency? If not, then it's worth getting evaluation and sorting out, okay, is it time to sell, or what is it going to take to sell? If you need help navigating that, of course, I'm glad to chat. The other piece would be, if you're noticing a lot of chaos and you'd like to calm the chaos, I would get the book. It's available on Amazon worldwide in print, Kindle, and Audible. It's a quick read or listen, just over 100 pages or just under 2.5 hours. And I've actually set up for listeners of the podcast, I've set up a way to get a free chapter from the book, kind of a free sample to check it out. And if you'd like to get that, you can go to bit.ly, so bit.ly/Karl DAG. So that's bit.ly/KARL DAG.
Awesome. Good on you for getting the tracking down. Well, it's better than I often do. Really appreciate it, Karl. We'll get that linked up, and always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Good luck to everyone out there, and hang in there.
Yeah.